At 5:52 on the morning of the 24th of May, 1941, in the cold grey waters of the Denmark Strait, HMS Hood opened fire at a range of approximately 26,500 yards. She was the pride of the Royal Navy, the mighty Hood, the largest warship in the world for 2 decades, and she was sailing directly into a trap that her own designers had, in a very real sense, set for her 25 years earlier. Within 8 minutes, she would be gone. And for 30 years after that, the Royal Navy would work quietly but deliberately to control what the public understood about why. This is the story of Hood's last battle, the explosion that killed 1,415 men, and the institutional silence that followed. To understand why the Denmark Strait mattered so acutely in May 1941, it is necessary to understand what the Germans were attempting. Operation Rheinübung, Exercise Rhine, was a commerce raiding mission of the first order. The Kriegsmarine intended to send the fast battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen into the North Atlantic to prey upon the convoys carrying supplies from North America to a Britain that was, at that point, fighting alone. The 2 fast battleships Starnhorst and Neisner had just completed a similar operation between January and March 1941, and the pressure on British supply lines was severe. The Germans had hoped to slip through undetected. That hope evaporated almost immediately. The Swedish cruiser Gotland spotted Bismarck and Prinz Eugen passing through the western Baltic on the 20th of May, and her report reached the British naval attaché in Stockholm within hours. RAF reconnaissance subsequently confirmed the German ship's presence in Norway. Coast watchers in Denmark had already tracked them from the moment they left German territorial waters. Admiral Gunther Lutjens, commanding the German force, had sought to delay the operation until Starnhorst completed repairs or the battleship Tirpitz could join him. Bismarck's sister ship was not yet operational. Starnhorst needed a boiler overhaul. Neisner had been damaged by air attack at Brest in early April. The heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Admiral She were both under refit, their progress delayed by British air strikes on supply depots at Kiel. Naval High Command overruled Lutjens and ordered him to sail at once. He went with only Prinz Eugen as his consort. The Royal Navy deployed accordingly. The heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk were ordered to cover the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. A second force, the Battlecruiser Hood and the battleship Prince of Wales, screened by 6 destroyers, Electra, Achates, Antelope, Antony, Echo, and Icarus, was positioned south of Iceland to intercept once the Germans were located. This force was under the command of Vice-Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag in Hood. On paper, Holland's force looked formidable. Hood carried 8 BL 15-inch MKI guns in 4 twin turrets, designated A, B, X, and Y from bow to stern, with 120 shells per gun. She had displaced 46,680 long tons at deep load. During sea trials in 1920, her 4 Brown Curtis geared turbines had delivered 151,280 shaft horsepower, exceeding their designed output of 144,000, driving her to 32.07 knots. She was fast, she was famous, and she was the symbolic heart of British naval power. On paper, she was more than capable of facing anything the Kriegsmarine could send against her. On paper. The reality was considerably darker, and Holland knew it. Hood had been laid down during the First World War as an Admiral-class battlecruiser, designed in response to the German Mackensen class. She was already under construction when the Battle of Jutland was fought in May 1916, and that battle exposed the fatal weakness of the battlecruiser concept with brutal clarity. The loss of HMS Indefatigable at Jutland demonstrated precisely what plunging shellfire could do to a ship whose deck armour had been sacrificed for speed. Hood's design was revised mid-construction to add approximately 5,000 long tons of additional armour, but to save time, this was achieved by thickening existing armour rather than redesigning the ship from the ground up. The result was a vessel that was 4 feet deeper in draft, so wet at speed that her quarterdeck flooded regularly and water entered the mess decks through ventilation shafts, earning her the sardonic nickname the largest submarine in the Navy. And she was still, structurally, a battlecruiser. Her main waterline belt was 12 inches of face-hardened Krupp cemented armour. Her gun turrets and barbettes were protected by 11 to 15 inches of the same material. But her deck armour, the armour that mattered against shells falling steeply from altitude at long range, was only 3 inches over the magazines, with just 2 inches over much of the upper deck. Even during her construction, live-firing trials with the new 15-inch armor-piercing capped shell against a Hood mock-up had demonstrated that such a shell could penetrate the ship's vitals through the 7-inch middle belt and the 2-inch slope of the main deck. 3-inch plating was added over the magazine slopes at a very late stage. A proposal was made in July 1919 to increase forward magazine protection to 5 inches and rear magazine protection to 6 inches, but this was never carried out pending further trials. Hood was completed and commissioned in 1920 with the vulnerability intact. For the next 2 decades, the Royal Navy was aware of it. Hood was scheduled to undergo a major rebuild in 1941 that would have doubled her deck armor to 6 inches. The outbreak of war in September 1939 cancelled those plans. The upgrades were never fitted. She went to war as she was, and as a consequence, Holland understood that he could not allow a prolonged long-range engagement. Plunging fire at distances beyond approximately 13,000 yards was exactly the threat Hood could not survive. His tactical plan for the Denmark Strait was built entirely around closing that range as rapidly as possible. Suffolk had regained contact with Bismarck just before 3 o'clock on the 24th. Hood and Prince of Wales were approximately 35 miles ahead of the Germans, slightly to the south. Holland immediately signalled a course toward the enemy and increased speed to 28 knots. But Suffolk's earlier loss of contact, she had been off the air from 028 for 90 minutes, had already compromised the plan. Instead of the head-on closing approach Holland had designed, the geometry had shifted. The 2 squadrons were now almost abeam of each other. That meant Hood would have to cross an extended fire zone at long range before she could close to a safer distance. At 3:20, Suffolk reported that the Germans had altered course further west. The British and German squadrons were now nearly parallel. At 5:35, lookouts on Prince of Wales sighted the German ships at 17 miles a distance. Holland chose action over shadowing at 5:37. The destroyer's role was negligible in the rough seas. Norfolk and Suffolk were too far astern of the Germans to reach the battle in time. What Holland had in his favour was the angle of the sun. Sunset at this latitude had been at 1:51, with a ship's clock set for hours ahead of local time. The Germans would be silhouetted against the afterglow. But Hood's approach angle had been forced wider than he intended, and at 5:52 in the morning, at 26,500 yards, with her bows pointed toward the enemy and only her forward turrets able to bear, Hood opened fire. Holland ordered his ships to engage the leading vessel, which he believed, incorrectly, to be Bismarck. Prince of Wales had already correctly identified Bismarck as the trailing ship and engaged her. Hood is believed to have continued firing on Prinz Eugen for some time, the heavy cruiser, not the battleship. Holland corrected this and ordered both ships to shift fire to Bismarck, but the misdirection had cost precious seconds in a fight where every second narrowed the closing time between Hood and comparative safety. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen returned fire almost immediately. At this range, their shells were arriving at a steep angle of descent, exactly the plunging trajectory that Hood's thin deck armor could not resist. What followed in the next several minutes has been reconstructed painstakingly from the testimony of the 3 survivors, from Prince of Wales, and from German observers. At approximately 5:55, Prinz Eugen's shell started a fire in Hood's boat deck near the base of the mainmast, involving ready-use ammunition for the UP rocket launchers, the unrotated projectile launchers added in 1940, each carrying 27-inch rockets. The fire burned visibly but was not itself catastrophic. Hood was still closing, still firing. Then, sometime around 6 o'clock, less than 8 minutes after Hood had opened fire, a shell from Bismarck struck near Hood's aft section. What happened next took approximately 3 minutes and killed 1,415 men. Hood's aft magazines detonated. The ship broke apart. Her bow and stern rose from the sea simultaneously, and within 3 minutes she had gone. Prince of Wales, still engaging Bismarck, was forced to steer hard to avoid Hood's wreckage. The destroyer screen searched the position and found only 3 survivors from a crew of 1,418, able seaman Robert Tilburn, midshipman William Dundas, and able seaman Ted Briggs. Prince of Wales continued to fight. Her crew was inexperienced, she had only been completed in late March 1941 and still had civilian shipyard workers aboard, and her quadruple-gun turrets were mechanically unreliable. She suffered serious malfunctions in her main armament and broke off the engagement. She had, however, scored hits on Bismarck, damaging the German ship's forward fuel tanks and contaminating her fuel oil supply. It was a detail that would prove operationally decisive. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes from Hood's first salvo to her loss. If you find yourself drawn to these accounts of how a single tactical moment can turn on a decision made 20 years earlier in a naval architect's office, this channel exists precisely for that kind of history. Subscribing means you'll be here for the next one. The Royal Navy held its first board of inquiry almost immediately after the loss. The board concluded that Hood's aft magazine had been detonated by a shell from Bismarck penetrating the ship's armour. That conclusion was, as the subsequent wreck survey would eventually confirm, almost certainly correct. But the first inquiry was criticized for failing to consider alternative explanations with sufficient rigor, in particular, whether the ship's torpedoes might have caused or contributed to the explosion, and whether an accidental detonation within one of the gun turrets might have propagated down into the magazine. A second inquiry was convened in response to those criticisms. It was more thorough than the first, examined additional evidence, and reached the same conclusion: a Bismarck shell had penetrated Hood's armour and detonated her aft magazine. The torpedo hypothesis, which some historians continued to advance, was examined and rejected. Hood carried 6 fixed 21-inch torpedo tubes, with approximately 28 torpedoes aboard, but the board found no compelling evidence that these had initiated the catastrophe. And yet the questions persisted. For 30 years, the precise sequence, which shell, at what exact point of impact, following which trajectory, remained officially unresolved in public. The Admiralty was not, by instinct, an institution that advertised its own failures. Hood's loss had been not merely a military catastrophe but a psychological one, the most famous ship in the world, the embodiment of British naval prestige, gone in 8 minutes. The detail that she had been scheduled for a protective rebuild that was never carried out, that she had been known for 2 decades to be vulnerable to exactly the kind of fire that killed her, that her own construction-era trials had demonstrated the inadequacy of her deck protection, none of this was the kind of information the Admiralty was eager to place before the grieving British public in the middle of a war. Tactically, the Germans had won the Denmark Strait decisively. But the strategic picture inverted almost at once. Bismarck's contaminated fuel forced Lutyens to abandon Operation Rheinübung and attempt to reach dry dock facilities in occupied France. The Royal Navy, incensed by Hood's loss, dispatched a large pursuing force. 3 days after the Denmark Strait, on the 27th of May, 1941, Bismarck was sunk. The commerce raiding operation that had cost Hood her life never achieved its objective. The wreck of Hood was located in 2001. The survey confirmed what both boards had concluded: the aft magazine had detonated. The precise mechanism, which shell struck where, by what exact path, remained impossible to determine, because the portion of the ship directly involved had been obliterated in the explosion itself. The inquiry findings were correct. But the 30 years of institutional reticence between the loss and any frank public accounting of Hood's known vulnerabilities had allowed speculation, myth, and the torpedo hypothesis to accumulate in the space that official candor might have filled. Hood had been built knowing she was vulnerable. The Royal Navy had known it for 20 years. The upgrade that might have saved her was cancelled by the very war she was asked to fight. And when she was gone, the institution that had sent her, aware of her weakness, unable to correct it in time, chose silence over disclosure, and let the legend carry the weight of what the armour could not. She had been called the Mighty Hood for 2 decades because of what she represented. She was lost in 8 minutes because of what she lacked. And the full measure of that gap, between the symbol and the ship, between the prestige and the protection, took a generation to reach the public record. Thank you for watching. If this account of Hood's loss and the silence that followed it is the kind of history that stays with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. The next ship story is already coming.